Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to begin in the 11th chapter of the second book to the Corinthians. We've already done the 16th through 33rd third verse, so we're going to take it all the way up until the 15th verse, and we've also done one on the preceding chapter, and we just wanted to briefly review that before we connect it to this. The Apostle Paul's apostolic authority was not unchallenged and uncontested throughout his career. He had a host of people located in Corinth, concentrated there, who undermined his authority, and these we learn he mocks as the super apostles. He was confident and secure of his apostolic authority, but he also had very keen insights into what he was against. He recognized Satan's presence, who was always trying to corrupt, compromise, disrupt, or distort Paul's ministry. So I'm personally of the opinion that one's knowledge of divinity will increase simultaneously and in proportion to their knowledge of Satan, because you become aware of the opposite when you study the authentic article. So he knew what he was up against. In the 4th verse, he says, "For the weapons we fight with are not fleshly, but mighty in Elohim for overthrowing strongholds." So the nature of the warfare was also something he had keen insights on. He recognized levels, principalities we read of in Ephesians 6:12. But also, you cannot fight this warfare with human weapons. We wage against spiritual, invisible entities. The demons are everywhere in our ministry. If we're embarked on the right path, they sure are. But the weapons that Elohim provides, he expounds most extensively on this in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, 10th through 18th verses. They are capable and competent to overthrow these satanic strongholds. And in the 8th verse, he says, "For even I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Master gave us for building up, and not for overthrowing you. I shall not be put to shame." So the you he's targeting the usurpers of whom we read of as the super apostles in the 11th chapter. So because he can triumph over Satan by remaining wholly submitted to the Messiah, and we'll get to that soon, he was capable of overthrowing Satan's human minions. So, and then the 5th verse we read, "Overthrowing reasonings and every high matter that exalts itself against the knowledge of Elohim, taking captive every thought to make it obedient to the Messiah." So the key in the glue is the obedience to the Messiah that enables us to overcome every vain human wisdom. And these super apostles were wise in the ways of the world, but they were not wise in the ways of divinity or spiritual warfare. Hence, they were no contest for Paul. They kind of did it behind his back. They snuck in after he had laid this healthy and fully flourishing assembly, and they created all sorts of problems. And then the 7th verse is, "Take a look at what you are facing. If anyone seems to trust in himself that he is of Messiah, let him reckon again for himself, that as he is of Messiah, so also are we." So it takes one to know one. If you know the Messiah as intimately and as totally as the Apostle Paul did, then you will recognize it instantly and automatically in others. And he was able to do this because he endeavored to keep every thought captive to the obedience of the Messiah. Now, how many thoughts do we have in a day? 1,000, 1,000,000, I don't know. But to try and keep every thought captive is the secret to success in our spiritual warfare. So we're going to open with the opening verse of the 11th chapter. "I would that you could bear with me in a little folly, but indeed you are bearing with me." So Paul mentions the word foolishness a lot. Beginning in the 1st chapter, he says that the foolish of the world are called and chosen to overthrow the wisdom of the world, much like we read recently in the 10th chapter, every stronghold. But fools, he uses the word fool in the 12th chapter too. In Romans 1:14, he is indebted to the wise and the fool. So Paul has a lot to say about fools. The only Old Testament rival I can think of would be Solomon in the book of Proverbs, but Paul certainly gives us detailed descriptions of fools and their purpose, and how the sovereign creator is able to use every deficient creation, every human deficiency as instruments in his wise and perfect design. For I am jealous for you with a jealousy according to Elohim, for I gave you in marriage to one husband, to present you as an innocent maiden to Messiah. Now, in the marriage arrangement, the relationship of the Messiah to his church is we are the bride, he is the groom. And so Paul was analogously in that role as the father who gave the bride away, but by the time he had left and he was addressing all these problems, he could not do that. So his whole duty was to make his bride, the church, pure, in order to make it presentable to the bridegroom who could be coming. He lived with the expectation. He said he lived in the last days, as did John. So he had I think a lot of the apostles had a sense that he would return in their lifetimes. Sadly, that fire has kind of burned out, but I'm personally of the opinion that, no man knows the day or the hour, but we do know the season, and 150 years tops before he really returns, in my estimation. I know I'm not supposed to do that, but that's what it is for what it's worth. But I am afraid, lest as the serpent deceived Eve by his trickery, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Messiah. So there's a lot to digest here. We're actually going to work backwards. Simplicity ties into the manner and the means through which he preached. He preached a simple message, the Messiah crucified, and that alone, that he says that he qualifies that much in the opening verse of the second chapter. And but these sophisticates, the more subtle and sophisticated, the more potential and wiggle room the serpent, Satan, has to lay his traps and deceptions, much as he did with Eve. So he is aware of their vulnerabilities. They are every bit as liable as Eve was to Satan's trap, because Satan was in their midst. He was working through these men who Paul is counteracting from a distance. And he's eventually, I don't know if he made it after the writing of this, but, they didn't really stand a chance against him. For indeed, if he who is coming proclaims another Yahshua, whom we have not proclaimed, or if you have received a different spirit from which you have not received, or a different good news which you have not accepted, you put up with it well enough. So he's warning against several things there. One, do not trust any message that is not consistent with the good news as you have known and been taught by me. So Paul told them the truth. Anything that contradicts that or changes or alters it in any way from what they have been told is an aberration and a corruption. And the different spirit, now these super apostles were of a different spirit. They preached, it's ultimately speculative, but I personally believe they preached a powerful Messiah, but they kind of neglected the crucifixion part, his moment of weakness, and the reasons why are not necessarily relevant, I feel. But this also reminds us of Galatians 1:8, where even if an angel from heaven came down and gave a good news message different from the one you have received and heard from me, let them be accursed. So if it's applicable to angels, how much more so to humans? For I reckon that I am not inferior to the most eminent apostles. So he had an accurate assessment and evaluation of his abilities. He kind of was the best Christian who ever lived, but he had a self-deprecating, humble way with words. So that was actually an understatement. Of course, he's even these false apostles. He was perhaps the greatest of the apostles, the authentic article. So he was clearly superior against these eminent. That's a term of sarcasm and derision. So he's deflating their claim to be apostles, what he is, and he's defending his authority throughout, beginning especially in the 10th chapter. But even if I am unskilled in word, yet not in knowledge, indeed in every way we have been manifested among you in all. So Paul was aware of we tend to by his own words, he wasn't a skilled preacher. He had a simple message. He had a mean appearance. He was not the most physically impressive person, and he had a voice that probably wasn't smooth or silky, but we know him through his writing. But the evidence indicates by Paul's own admission, he was not the most talented preacher, shall we say. He was certainly the best of, greatest evangelist who ever lived, and his preaching did accomplish wonders. And it was only in a city that was as worldly and cosmopolitan as Corinth that the different spirit of which he warned, the spirit of the world, their world, would have been to elevate artificially the significance and substance of skilled sophistry. Or did I commit sin in humbling myself in order to exalt you, because I brought good news, the good news of Elohim, to you without being paid? So the answer to this question, this rhetorical question, is obviously no, he did not sin. One cannot sin in humbling themselves in order to exalt others. That's how the paradoxical equation works, not only with others, but with ourselves. And so he brought the good news in its pristine and pure form, and he did it all without being paid. So he was giving them a priceless measure, professional quality service, free of charge. And amazingly, many of his detractors use this against him as proof that he was not skilled. He did not know what he was talking about because he had not accepted their wages. But he knew that he had the superior argument in having refused wages, but he was also realistic enough to recognize that imposing his own Spartan standard of ministry without pay was not realistic for the survival of the church. Hence, he did not impose it in passages such as 1 Corinthians 9:11 and 14. Others' assembly I robbed by receiving wages to serve you. So he didn't literally rob, and he didn't receive wages. These nearby assemblies from Macedon, we read in the next verse, kind of came in and gave him support and coverage, everything he really needed, but they didn't pay him any salary in his pocket. So he had established connections throughout the entire Mediterranean, something no Corinthian could claim. And he had everything he needed, even if these churches were stingy and, taking everything but giving nothing back. He had enough solid resources and networks with the other places he had set by. So this one was in Macedonia, which is to the immediate north of Greece, or the Roman province of Achaia. And when I was present with you and in need, I was not a burden to anyone. For what was lacking to me, the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied, and in every way I kept myself, and shall keep, from being a burden of you. So he could have used the opportunity to say, listen, do you think I could get some compensation for all my efforts and all my trails and all my ails for you? But he promises them that what he has done, he will do unto death. He will never accept wages. He was a tent maker by trade, and Jewish rabbis, the training he would have had, were accustomed to working with their hands and not receiving money for their services. So he's not, his perpetual obligation is not to be a burden or a stumbling block or an offense to anyone else. We read this in places such as Romans 14, where he lays out the dynamics between the weaker and the stronger brother, how we're to sort of coexist in mutual harmony. It is a truth of Messiah in me that this boasting in me shall not be stopped in the districts of Achaia. Achaia, remember, is the modern country of Greece. And boasting is a word that appears prolifically throughout these 3 chapters, the one which comes before it and the one which comes after it. So in the 10th chapter, we read of that word in the 8th verse and in the 13th verse, and we read boasting in the 15th verse, and then we read boasting once more in the 12th verse. We'll get to that. And then the 16th verse, which launches what comes after that, is boasting, and then he says boasting in the next, and then boast in the 18th, and closes it all with boast in 30. And the second word of the opening verse of the 12th chapter is boasting. So this theme, this concept of boasting, really bleeds in across these 3 chapters. Now, the nature of his boasting is a subject unto itself. What we could do is read each of these passages and comment on it, but I think that's going to get us unnecessarily far away. So that being said, we're just going to return to the text, 11th verse. Why is it that I do not love you? Elohim knows. So this is a rhetorical question. Of course he loved them. A self-evident answer to the rhetorical question of why. Why would he do it all? Why would he go through these lengths and these sacrifices and pay a price without being paid for paying the price unless he loved them? So his ministry was motivated by love, not money, and he didn't want money getting in the way of love, and he was content with the fact that Elohim knows that he was motivated by love and his intentions were pure, and all that stuff. 12th verse. And I shall go on doing this as I do, in order to cut off the occasion from those desiring an occasion, so that in which they boast they might be found also as we are. So this is occasion kind of translates as confrontation, and he speaks against the heretics who stir up arguments and strifes and controversies in some of his epistles. So we gather that these types of ministers were here, and he is addressing them, and they were always trying to undermine him and challenge him and deflate him. But they had plenty to boast in. They had all the skills that he did not. They had the urbanity, the sophistication, the aura of civilization, but they were not. They did not know the truth like this man did, and they were not willing to pay the price for this truth that Paul was willing to pay. He lived for it, and he ultimately died for it. That is something no false apostle, false shepherd, even false disciple would ever do. Now he gets to the heart of the matter in the final 3 verses. Remember, when we commented on the 4th verse of the 10th chapter, we recognized that Paul recognized and was aware of Satan's presence in his spiritual warfare. And if you think Satan isn't in your life and active and against you, let me tell you right now, just because you became a born-again believer, that actually the attacks, if anything, are going to increase because there is no skull he takes more pride, joy, and delight in bringing back than that of the born-again believer. As soon as you became born again, you became public enemy number 1. You have a bullseye target on your head, your heart, and your soul. So the 13th verse reads, For such are false apostles, deceptive workers, masquerading as apostles of Messiah. So they called themselves apostles. They claimed to be apostles of the Messiah, but they were rooted in deception, and in the Messiah no deception dwells. Hence they must be masquerading as someone else. These men are counterfeits. They are phonies. They are rejects. They are not what they claim. All who claim to believe do not believe as they claim, and this was certainly true of these false apostles. They were false. Their message was false. The one they served was false, and we're going to learn exactly who that is. Spoiler alert, it's the adversary. And no wonder, for Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. So the prince of darkness assumes the form of an angel of light. And why would he do that? Well, because, when Satan presents himself, he gives you the rosy picture. He doesn't tell you the sorrow, devastation, and death. And even though he is an ugly creature and evil, he makes evil seem so innocent and so fun and so worth it. And but he is a counterfeit artist because he's a created being. He mimics an inferior, corrupt versions of the divine authentic article, one example of which we read the word love. Lust is his counterfeit version of love. It has enough of the properties and natures of love to confuse that him or her who is smitten of its spirit that it is the authentic article. But that's just one of Satan's tricks, and he was working through these men. It is not surprising, then, if his servants also masquerade as servants of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. So those who submit to Satan, they are mimicking the one who mimics Elohim. He does not have an original or creative thing to call his own. And as they are disciples, so much in the same way that we mimic the model, we pattern our lives around the Messiah. These men, perhaps without even knowing, maybe they thought they were preaching the Messiah, but they were not familiar enough with Satan's reality or existence or work in their life to acknowledge that they were, in fact, stooges of Satan. I don't think any of them were outright Satan worshipers, but that just goes to show that Satan is alive and well in the church, and it's been every way. He is in the house of God, and he's been there, and it's going to get worse. But we do by your fruits you shall know them. So these men could not claim as an abundant harvest as Paul had to his credit and on his report card. And, they all have to answer. Their end shall be according to their works. So when we take the ministry privilege, it is ultimately, there are consequences for abusing that privilege. And Paul was the model of incorrupt approach to ministry. And, that's whether you are a disciple, you are a minister. And so that every member a minister is the ideal of the authentic assembly or church. So I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.